Sovereign wealth funds or social wealth funds are investment funds owned and operated by the state government. Now, why would a state operate a sovereign wealth fund in the first place? What utility could this provide to the people and the government, and how exactly does this relate to socialism? Well, I'm going to talk about that and a whole lot more as I walk you through all the research I did on social wealth funds over the last few months. To begin at the most fundamental level, an investment fund in this context is a pool of different assets owned and managed by an entity. These assets could be any number of things from stocks to bonds to real estate. In my What is the Stock Market video, I talk about how, in this sense, social wealth funds are actually quite common in many parts of most every nation. If a social wealth fund is just a state-managed investment fund, then things like endowment funds for universities or pension funds for cities are subnational social wealth funds. Now, why would a state want to operate an investment fund? Well, for a lot of reasons, really. If we think basically about money management and finance, it's not really that good to have a bunch of cash just lying around all the time. For instance, say after all your costs at the end of the month, you have $1,000 you can save. It probably doesn't make as much sense to just leave that cash sitting in your checking account because there's probably a savings account that can earn 0.5% or 1% interest. And $1,000 plus 0.5% or 1% is better than just $1,000 by itself, at least if you think more money is better than less money. In the same vein, if the government as a whole or a government agency has a surplus of cash or a regular revenue stream, it makes more sense to take this extra cash and invest it into something that can make a rate of return more than just leaving that cash sitting in a government treasury. Because at least in economics, once again, mo money does not indeed mean mo problems. Now this brings me to an important question to address in this video. Isn't this risky? Would we really want the government to invest a bunch of money into the stock market, bond market, and assorted other markets with the aim of earning money on the taxes we already pay them, or a return on the money they already get from state agencies, state entities, and or other revenue sources? Well, yes and no. Without going into it too much, all investing is risky to some extent, but if you're smart about it, you can substantially reduce an investment portfolio's exposure to risk even when combining highly risky assets. For instance, some college endowment funds invest in venture capital, which is considered one of the riskiest classes of assets. So let's say, for example, a university has a $10 billion endowment. They might use 4% of this endowment a year to fund regular operations, meaning this is money the university is absolutely counting on every year to meet their funding obligations. The university needs this $400 million a year, so why would they invest in such a risky thing like venture capital? Well, it's because venture capital doesn't always move up or down in the same direction, the same speed, or the same variance as something like bonds or stocks, which make up the bulk of the average university endowment portfolio. And skipping over a bunch of boring finance talk, it's possible to construct a portfolio of assets where each individual asset is riskier than the market average, but when combining these assets, we actually end up with a lower risk with a higher return. Look up portfolio optimization if you want to learn more about this concept outside the context of this video. This is the foundational governing philosophy to most investment funds, and that's why if a fund is managed well, there's not a lot of reason to be overly worried about the riskiness of the fund's investment assets themselves. They might have a bad year here and there, but in the long run, the fund will probably return more than it loses. At least it'll return more than just leaving your cash in your bank account. However, the phrase "if the fund is managed well" is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, and understanding this, another question becomes important to answer. Should we really trust the government to manage investments? And additionally, is any risk at all acceptable when talking about tax money or revenue from government operations? To answer this question, I'll reiterate one point and make another. One, more money is better than less money. So if it's the case that we can obtain a reliable return on the money the government holds in its treasury, then it makes sense to go ahead and invest it. After all, every dollar of money the government earns from an investment fund could be a dollar that the government doesn't need to collect in the form of taxation, which I'm sure at times we can all appreciate. Secondly, to the question of should we trust the government to manage investment funds, let's talk about the penultimate example of government social wealth funds, Norway. Norway is certainly not the only country which manages a social wealth fund, but it's certainly the most popular example, and probably for good reason. It's absolutely gigantic. Despite being over 250 times smaller than China in terms of population, the Norwegians have a larger social wealth fund. So, in order to determine whether or not the government can responsibly and sustainably manage such a fund or funds, we will look at the Norwegian social wealth fund and answer a few basic questions. What is the fund's origin? How is it managed? And how is it invested? To begin, Norway technically has 3 social wealth funds. The smallest, which we won't get into, is actually a national church endowment which seems to own and manage a bunch of land in Norway that is typically historically associated associated with the clergy. Fun fact aside, the second is a relatively small pension fund called the Government Pension Fund Norway, which was established in 1967. The fund takes money from the national pension system and invests it in a mix of equities, which is basically the ownership of businesses, and fixed income, which is basically the ownership of bonds and debt instruments. This fund particularly is only allowed to invest in Norwegian assets, or more broadly, Nordic assets. Currently, the fund is 85% invested in Norwegian markets, and its equity investments represent over 11% of the Oslo Stock Exchange. The fund is worth around 30 to 40 billion USD, and in terms of how it's managed, let's see here. It's managed by the Storting, yes, the Norwegian parliament, I guess, who devolves its authority over the fund to the Minister of Finance, well, of course, that makes some sense, who ultimately delegates the operations of the fund to... oh, fuck. The Folketrygdfondet? Jesus. The
Folketrygdfondet
operates under a board of managers who are appointed by the government, and the actual investments are made by a team under the supervision of the board and the executive management of the fund, and the money generated by this fund goes to the national pension system. Okay, now let's talk about the third fund. This fund is called the Government Pension Fund Global. Not an incredibly creative naming convention over in Norway, and anyone researching this should probably note the bigger fund is called the Government Pension Fund Global, and the smaller fund is called the Government Pension Fund Norway. Anyways, the Government Pension Fund Global, or the Oil Fund, was established in 1990 by the Norwegian Parliament, where the profits from the state oil company and oil-related government investing are invested into a fund which, according to the Norwegian Parliament, ensures that the petroleum wealth benefits both current and future generations. This fund is also invested in a mix of equities and fixed income securities, and while the smaller social wealth fund can only invest in Norwegian or Nordic assets, the much larger global social wealth fund, perhaps emblematic of its name, can only invest in foreign assets in foreign currency. The Norwegian Global Social Wealth Fund is worth around 1.372 trillion USD equivalent as of 2021. This fund alone represents over $250,000 for every single Norwegian man, woman, and child, and in fact, according to a Credit Suisse report, the total wealth of the entire country of Norway was 1.154 trillion USD. At the conclusion of 2020, the Norwegian Social Wealth Fund was worth around 1.3 trillion USD. So somehow the Norwegian Social Wealth Fund has more wealth than the entire country. Okay, well, not really. The ability of economists to measure total wealth isn't exactly the greatest, so there's probably some fuzziness with the data here. But let's just say a seriously significant portion of Norway's entire national wealth is controlled by Norway's global government pension fund, at least based on all of the analyses that I've seen. So how is this big ol' oil fund managed? Well, it's managed by Norges Bank, which is the Norwegian version of the Federal Reserve, the central bank of Norway. The executive board of Norges Bank is appointed by the King's Council, which is made up of government ministers. This board determines the executive management of the fund and oversees its operations. The money earned by the Global Investment Fund goes towards generic government operations. This is strictly controlled, however, and it's not as if the government can just raid the social wealth fund however they'd like. This amounts to the government taking around 3% of the fund's total balance each year for spending money. 3% of the fund in 2021 represented around $40 billion, and to put this in perspective, the Norwegian government spent around $178 billion total in 2021. Both of these funds are overseen within a democratic framework and face strict transparency and reporting standards so as to ensure adequate public scrutiny of these funds. After all, this is public money being invested. The performance of these funds have been remarkably stable over time, slowly and consistently growing long term. And although Norway is the biggest example, its story of stable and consistent growth is absolutely not unique amongst the thousands of different social wealth funds across the world. So to answer the question, should we trust governments to invest public funds? Well, it seems a relatively independent operating framework with some democratic oversight makes for a good stewardship of public dollars invested in a diversified set of assets. So I feel that we've established that the government under a decent framework can obtain a reliable return on the open market that helps fund government operations and generate equitable societal wealth. Another big advantage of social wealth funds, and probably the biggest reason I advocate for them, is the diversification of economic wealth. We've all heard stories of precariously set up economies that are overly dependent on one industry or another. Some classic examples that come to mind are Venezuela's dependence on oil and Botswana's dependence on diamonds. Each of these economies is made a lot wealthier because of their natural resource wealth. However, as was the case in 2016 during the oil crisis, an over-reliance on a single commodity was not exactly great for the Venezuelan people, as the government experienced an economic catastrophe it still hasn't truly recovered from. Botswana is similarly dependent on the diamond trade, but they're just lucky that the market is still around. However, it might not always be, and both of these countries are good examples of nations that would probably benefit greatly from either creating a social wealth fund or expanding their social wealth fund, which takes the surplus from their respective resource wealth and invests it into a diversified investment fund. Fundamentally, social wealth funds make a resource-rich economy generally more resilient. This way, society is made wealthier from its resources whilst also having a sustainable wealth generation scheme for generations in the future who might face more harsh economic circumstances or market circumstances which are not advantageous to the resources traditionally cultivated within the country. Now, this brings me to an important set of questions to point out. As an advocate for social wealth funds, it's important to ask, why should this social wealth fund exist, and where does this social wealth fund get its money from? Most all social wealth funds were born of relatively specific contexts. For instance, the Saudi, Norwegian, and Alaskan social wealth funds get the bulk of their money from oil revenues. As I mentioned before, another example is that many governments, local, state, and national, have pension social wealth funds that go towards supporting the longevity of state pension plans. There are many reasons and funding schemes for social wealth funds, but it's important to understand where the money comes from and where it goes so as to allow a more logical governing framework to be established. So now that we've established some utility of social wealth funds, that they're a decent way to generate societal wealth in a sustainable way, and they're a decent way to diversify the economy, let's talk about how this ties into socialism. Many socialists in the modern era have used social wealth funds as an example of a potential path towards socialism. After all, if socialism is collective ownership of the means of production, a social wealth fund under a democratic framework which owns a bunch of assets sounds like it could be considered pretty socialist to me. And so in that vein, let's talk about whether or not social wealth funds could scale to the extent that we would consider it socialism, and in such a way that would actually be good and efficient for the economy. To begin, I don't think social wealth funds represent a sustainable path to socialism. I'll use the Norwegian social wealth fund as an example throughout, as again, it's the most often cited example of social wealth funds, and it's also the model I've researched the most about. Firstly, by a reasonable definition of socialism, if a social wealth fund owned 100% of businesses in a nation, we'd probably call that socialism, especially if that country was an open and transparent democracy. At the same time, if a social wealth fund only owned 1% of a nation's private businesses, this probably wouldn't be considered socialism under most people's definition of socialism. With that said, is Norway a socialist country? After all, as I mentioned previously, a large majority of the nation's wealth is collectivized in the form of their social wealth funds. Well, personally, I wouldn't say so, as 95% of the social wealth fund's ownership is invested in foreign enterprises, and when we talk about collective ownership of the means of production, we're probably implicitly referencing the means of production affecting the society itself, and not just some generic wealth of a society despite said wealth's origins. Okay, so if Norway couldn't be considered socialist purely based off of its social wealth fund, what about the broader class of assets that the Norwegian government controls or has an interest in? Well, as of 2019, just under 30% of the Oslo Stock Exchange was owned by the government. This might sound quite significant, but we have to keep in mind that this is total government ownership, so not just one single fund, meaning independent funds are making decisions as to what to invest in, and this is only companies listed on the stock exchange. As of November 2021, Norway had around 18,000 private businesses, and only around 300 to 350 companies actually publicly traded on the Oslo Stock Exchange. And that's including the fact that the government pension fund Norway, the one allowed to invest in domestic companies as of 2020, only had ownership representative of 11% of the Oslo Stock Exchange equity. This means that a large portion of the government ownership that I mentioned of domestic equity is decentralized amongst many different ministerial and local investment funds. This is all to say that the vast majority of private business ownership in Norway is not collectively controlled by a singular state entity or by state entities in general. So even Norway doesn't exactly have a mostly collectivized economy, but could they? Would it be theoretically possible? And what are the implications of a government controlling the majority of business ownership through investments made by a social wealth fund or similar construct? To begin, I am generally skeptical of a social wealth fund controlling a majority of business equity in an economy or a majority of the capital markets of an economy, and so transitively, I'm generally skeptical of social wealth funds as a means towards socialism. I think that we would probably run into capital formation problems, overinvestment, and/or generally the inefficient allocation of capital when a social wealth fund begins to dominate the domestic market for equity and debt. For instance, the global pension fund, the trillion-dollar Norwegian social wealth fund, only owns around 9,000 companies, and that's with millions of companies to pick from on a worldwide scale. Now, imagine a scenario where the state would need to take a similar level of investment only in domestic companies in Norway. The state would essentially eat up the entire public equity market and a sizable chunk of privately owned companies. This can be problematic because it would be difficult for the state to efficiently allocate this capital relative to the market at such a large scale, and this type of economy would likely face similar problems with overinvestment as other socialist societies would struggle to overcome their soft budget constraints. After all, if the state is personally and directly invested in the bulk of business operations in an economy, it makes sense that the state would use its power to prop up potentially inefficient and/or failing businesses. Another thing worth mentioning is that part of the reason for and one of the big advantages of social wealth funds should be the diversification of economy-specific risk. And if a state's social wealth fund is significantly invested directly in the bulk of an economy's businesses, we probably wouldn't see the same economic stability benefits from the social wealth fund that we see in many social wealth funds across the globe. This means it's important for a social wealth fund to either be small enough not to eat away the bulk of the equity market, or if it's large enough, it should probably be predominantly invested in foreign assets. The last thing I'll mention in this regard is that a large portion of most every social wealth fund is not invested only in business equity. This is mostly for risk mitigation. After all, fixed income instruments are more stable than business equity most of the time, and socialism seems generally primarily interested in the means of production, which often amounts to ownership of businesses. Perhaps this is an oversimplification, but in all the hours of lectures, debates, and readings that I've done on socialism, I haven't seen a ton of focus on debt markets. Although all the same criticisms I've just given of an overly involved state actor would certainly also apply to both the equity and debt markets. It's just something to keep in mind that if a social wealth fund only invested in business equity, it would likely not be as stable as the current standard model of a social wealth fund. In general, I don't imagine a society which has a majority or predominance of domestic business ownership collectivized in a social wealth fund would be better than a society with a more modest social wealth fund and/or a larger social wealth fund invested in foreign markets. I think this is a more sustainable path forward for most social wealth funds overall. To close, I think social wealth funds are almost an entirely good thing for an economy. At least I couldn't really think of great counterarguments for them, and I couldn't get into all the reasons why they're great in this video, but either take my word for it or feel free to do your own research. I don't think we should be necessarily worried about the government investing money, and I think there's actually a great conservative argument for social wealth funds that it could result in less taxation, and a great left argument for social wealth funds that we're engaging in a more democratic governance of the economy. However, I am skeptical of social wealth funds as a primary means to achieve socialism, especially relative to other means by which the economy might be rebalanced, such as union membership, worker board membership, equitable taxation, government welfare programs, and all the other things we've discussed on this channel thus far. What I have found thus far in my economics studies is that frustratingly, often the best economic solution is a more measured one, at least relative to all the more esoteric ideas we who are interested in economics often discuss. Thanks for watching. I hope that you all enjoyed this video. If you did, consider donating to me on my Patreon. If you donate $1, you get a bunch of cool benefits, and if you donate $5 or more, your name will be read out at the end of my scripted videos like this one. With that said, I'd like to thank Tyrion S., The Power of Friendship, Robert McLaughlin, Hypothetical, James Nicholas Bryant, Oysen Challoner, Pranav Anand, Cedric Cole, Greg M., Bassett, and Paul Fernandez.